All right, you know what it is. It's the King's Gambit, and I am International Master David Pruess here for Chess.com with another King's Gambit Principles video. We're again going to see how we apply our principled thinking to the opening phase while playing the super awesome King's Gambit. The second example is also going to be from a King's Gambit declined. So the branch of the King's Gambit that I usually don't apply as much weight to or spend as much time on, but it's pretty important, it's pretty common, and so I thought it would be interesting to pick a couple cool examples from it. And that's what we're doing now. And if you like this, if you like the King's Gambit, I'm going to plug my course again. Come join the King's Gambit course from Chess.com University. Okay, here we go. This game, black plays bishop c5, more ambitious than d6. Now, already at this point, I would look at the position and apply some principles and think about it, right? So, to me, if white develops very simply against this bishop to c5 line, then the pressure on e5 will approximately be compensated for by the weakness on this diagonal, which I've highlighted here. So to me, it's never been very, very exciting to get into this variation here. You know which one I mean? Like this, right? Where it's like both players have played a Gioco Piano, but white somehow played f2 to f4. In my games in this position, I've usually felt like the inability to castle kingside, right, and the tempo of development that black gets off of white moving the f-pawn compensates for white's extra pressure on the center. So I've never been thrilled with this. So I feel like if your opponent plays the bishop c5 variation, as white, you should probably prepare to play the c3 and d4 line in response. Okay, and so that's what I usually do, and that's what we see in this game here. So white plays c3. Now, black has at least has more than one move here. Basically, their bishop's probably going to move to b6 or to b4, but they can develop their knight on c6 or their knight on f6, their choice. And playing bishop b6 is sort of the same thing, right? Because now you could either play knight to f6 or knight to c6, with or without trading on d4. So in this game, black plays knight f6, and both are reasonable. So takes. Check. So this kind of a move here, I don't like it very much because it accelerates your opponent's development, right? So there's some cases where it's plausible, and here black uses it to make threats against e4, and that's fine. That happens. He creates some weak squares in white's camp on the e file and gets some counter threats. So this is a playable move, but whenever your opponent plays a move like this, you need to keep track of what the move means. What are the pluses and minuses of each move so that you can adjust your thinking in the future, right? So here what I want you to realize when your opponent does this, I want you to adjust your thinking to realize that, hey, your opponent just wasted some development time by playing bishop to b4, right? So even though you spent all this time building your center, you are actually half a move ahead in development all over again as if you were white. You've regained all your lost time pushing pawns while your opponent was moving that dark squared bishop, okay, to c5 and then d4 and then d2. But your potential problem is that you currently are weak on 3 squares. So I'm going to switch the d4 square out, highlight e3, and now you see the 3 squares which are temporarily weak. So white needs to be quite conscious of that weakness and try and cover those squares before something bad happens. Okay, so very important situation. Black needs to know what they were trying to do. They're trying to attack those squares. So if they play simple moves like castling, let white develop, and then maybe develop their piece and let white just castle. White simply has this powerful center for nothing. Really basically just for nothing. And the position should favor white dramatically, I think. So, that said, what should black do in this position? Well, if you got overexcited and played aggressively knight takes e4, that's not right either. That's an overplay because after queen e7, white has a way to save this knight. They just play queen e2 and remain ahead a piece, and white wins. But that was close to the right answer. What black should do is queen to e7, as he did. And this is obviously going to lead to some critical variations. Now, white has a big choice here about what they want to do about the pawn on e4. So, what are white's major choices and which one do you favor? Pause the video and think about that for yourself a little bit. Now, you may need to have done some calculation as well as just, puzzling out what your instinct is or what principles might be in operation here. Let's see what you think, okay? Let's start talking. You can always pause and think some more. But e5 is definitely one option. That defends the e4 pawn, and basically it hides both of these weak squares by blocking on e5 where white has quite a strong square. So then black could play something like knight to d5, attacking the f4 pawn. White's going to need to defend that pawn. Right, so presumably like this, g3. And now black has more than one option, but one option is to go here and take white's bishop and leave white with weak light squares. There's definitely an option, but one other thing I want to point out is that you can just trade like this for black, bring out your bishop, and white's center pawns are blockaded without too much difficulty by black. And I've never been a huge fan of getting this 2-2-2 pawn structure, right? 2 on the queen side, then the file without a pawn, 2 in the center, file on the bishop pawn, then 2 there. I've never been in favor of getting this 2-2-2 kind of pawn structure when the pawns in the center are blockaded, because there's no pawn that can help them get unblockaded, and your position is often kind of like sterile, not dynamic, you can't really move much. Here white has a good amount of space because the pawns are far advanced and they're on dark squares, so it's probably like playable for white, but really, really far from thrilling, okay, and I would not recommend that approach. So that principally leaves defending the pawn with your bishop or with your queen. So defending with the queen is the solid way to defend it. It's defended for sure. You're not going to lose the pawn. You're not going to run into any tactics from the black queen against your king because your queen is there. But you might have to castle queenside instead of kingside, and you're going to have to figure out what to do with the bishop on f1, right? Ideally, you would rather just develop the bishop to d3, defend the pawn, castle kingside where you've got more pawn cover, and then just crush black in a sort of simple positional style because of your big center. Okay, when you have like nice positional advantages, it's often not in your interest to complicate the position by putting kings on opposite sides. It depends. Controlling the center can often help you attack on opposite sides. But here, I feel like it might just be making the situation a little bit weirder for white and taking away from the value of your center. So when I have this nice essential advantage, my instinct is I want to try and play bishop to d3 and castle kingside. Now, that's what happens in this game, and now comes the big question. What should black do here? What's black's next move after bishop d3? Remember, black is the one who really has the onus on them of coming up with something. Of course, white also has some really key decisions to make here because they have to foresee, what are the different ways black can mess with me and try and break up my center, and can I prevent all of those tactically and consolidate? So, I mean, it's a hard position for both players, but black's the one who has to come up with something. So what would black come up with here? What do you think? All right, well, in the game, black played knight to d5, attacking 2 of the 3 weak squares that white has. So did you think of that as a possibility? Do you find that consistent? Is that a promising looking reaction from black? So the answer is no. It's moving the knight again. The knight was already aimed at one of white's weaknesses, right? Now black moves that knight again without doing anything on e4 while white, has successfully continued developing. And they do have these two threats on e3 and f4, but it feels unnatural. It feels like white should be able to ignore one or both of those threats and get a good game because they've got this big center and they're developing quickly. And these two threats from black are just not as crushing as the threat of taking white's e-pawn, okay? Because if you imagine this position here without white's e-pawn, you see that white's pawn structure wouldn't be very beautiful, right? But if you imagine the position without white's f-pawn, white still has a structure they can play with. Same if you imagine, black coming into e3 and maybe somehow getting the g-pawn, white could still have a really good game. So these threats are just not sufficiently devastating. So what should black have done? Well, if you came up with bishop to f5, then you are also wrong. Because white plays queen to e2, defending the pawn and threatening the bishop. So black's going to now lose time dealing with the threat on the bishop. So that's useless. All right. Thank goodness some of you guys like to castle, right? Yeah, unfortunately, castling here is a big mistake, so I really wish you hadn't chosen to castle. Just messing with you guys, but castling is not incisive enough here because basically it gives white the chance to consolidate everything they have. Black needed to make a dent in that, so white just castles. And this is exactly the kind of position which I think is terrible for black, where they're in big danger of just getting rolled over by white's massive pawn center. So the only interesting move for black to make this entire bishop b4 check variation, worth considering is to play knight takes e4. And now the point is that after white takes the knight, black's going to win back the piece that they have sacrificed. Note that they are not going to try and win the piece back with their bishop because, again, after queen e2, black's just lost their piece. Okay, so d5. Now white will castle. Black has to take back. And white takes back the pawn, right? Because you guys can all follow this tactic, queen takes bishop, rook to e1. So material is equal, right? Black sacrificed their knight for a pawn, then won back a knight for a pawn. What they've done is they've successfully hurt white's positional advantage, right? They've made a serious dent in white's center. But at the same time, black's burned energy to do that, and white is now well ahead in development. So this is a very, critical and tricky situation here for black. And, black probably needs to castle next, and now they need to be prepared for, several possible moves from white. Knight e5, knight g5, queen d3, queen c2, or even maybe bishop takes h7 as a sacrifice. Basically a few moves that black needs to be prepared for here. And there's a lot of dynamic possibility for white here, right? To use the fact that they're 2 tempi ahead in development, and that their pieces are pretty nicely and actively placed, right? This knight and bishop. So that's sort of like a critical position for the bishop b4 check variation that black played this game. But since black doesn't do it, they quickly get into a bad position, right? And this is going to be a cautionary tale for how badly things can go wrong quickly. So black plays knight to d5. Anybody who had the instinct that this wasn't a great move, that's good. That instinct is going to help guide you to feel like you should be able to get a good position. And why? Well, because you just need to weather these 1 or 2 threats, and you're getting ahead in development. You should be able to solidify your whole center. So what would you have come up with here for white? The answer is actually kind of very simple, unassuming move. White just defends the bigger of the 2 threats, the pawn on f4. Now you might be concerned that white's weakening the light squares around their king, but this shouldn't be a devastating handicap. White should still be able to get a good game just because the black pieces aren't going to be very active because of white's huge center. So a little bit of weakness around your king is not going to be a concern. Instead, you just defend the pawn that they're attacking because it's a nice center pawn, and just stay relaxed, stay loose, right? This knight e3 move does nothing because you just play queen e2 attacking the knight. Absolutely useless for black. So with the knight still dangling, black plays knight to c6. Now, what would you do for white? I'd like you to be able to, convert a position like this to feel confident coming up with good moves for white here. So if you answered castling, that falls into knight e3, winning a rook for the knight. You might be slightly concerned about knight to b4 by one of the black knights, but if you really think about it, is that really a huge concern? Let's consider. So the move in the game, queen e2, preparing to castle. If black plays knight to b4, white's bishop gets stuck on b1, right, trapping the rook in. However, where's this knight going to next? It's quite a badly placed knight, right? So white should have time here to still, get a very, very nice game. Expand like this. This knight goes back to b8. Right now you can play bishop a2 or bishop d3. Either one is plausible. Of course, I would just castle first, and after black castles. And then you can decide between bishop c2 or bishop a2. But white has a great game, right? I mean, they've defended their whole center, and the black pieces are definitely feeling cramped by white's advanced pawns. Right? So when you think about it more, knight to b4 is not the kind of move that you need to be concerned about. You don't want to take time out to play a3 here, and you don't want to rush rook to c1 in order to play bishop to b1. The reason you don't want to do those is because you realize that knight to b4 doesn't actually help black. You waste a move on your bishop, but how many moves is black going to spend on their knight after this? More moves than you move your bishop, right? More moves than I'm going to count. So queen e2 is a strong move, and black just decided to retreat their knight over here so they won't have to keep moving it. But obviously, both black knights are pretty passive at the moment, and white just has an undisputed advantage here. They castle successfully, their whole center is safe, and black has basically no hope in this position, or very little hope. I guess there's always some hope, but really, really very little. And I'll just play through the rest of the moves of the middle game for you, just to give you a sense for what the game looks like, right? How the shape of the game is determined by your opening decisions, and how you can get sort of an easy game by playing some good moves earlier on. Okay, so rook to c1, placing the rook on the semi-open file and putting some pressure against black's backward c pawn, which is just like a nice, useful positional move. Bishop to g4, a move which black could have played on several occasions to threaten d4. It would have always been answered the same. White just moves the queen to defend the pawn and get off the diagonal of the bishop. So here black lashed out with d5, trying to gain back some breathing room in the center because they were cramped and didn't have any idea of what to do. Right? If they do nothing, white might eventually use a plan of a3 and b4. Right? White also has the idea of controlling the h3 square and trying to roll the pawns with h3. So that would be like something like, let's say black waits around, and let's say I put something like king to g2 for white. And now they're going to play h3 and g4 and gain even more space. It's possible. I would prefer a more positional plan using my rook on the c-file personally. So what black does is they lash out. White just pushes past, right, keeping all their pawns on the dark squares and with like a nice space advantage here with the head pawn in the center, and black still has problems on this file. So it's like no counterplay for black here. Normally they would try and struggle a little bit against white's pawn center with f6. But white is so strong here that it can only end badly for black. This, however, is a move which exacerbates black's problems by weakening the dark squares more, although it's hard to suggest much more. White plays knight g5, threatening h3. Black chases the knight. Okay, fine, white comes back. There's one more little weakness in black's position. And after black develops the rook, white just breaks open the king side with f5. a simple little pawn sacrifice. The point is just to next move, play knight h4 and knight f5. So black took it, knight h4, pawn can't get away, and the black knights, because of white's center, they're stuck pretty far away from his king, who's now about to become pretty weak. And with white's space advantage, they can transfer their pieces pretty easily towards the king side. So you see white just used a very simple solution here. He trades bishops because the knight on f5 is so strong. Now he's got the dominating knight on f5. White's threatening all kinds of stuff. I mean, pawn to h4, for example. Just trying to kick that queen. So black challenges the knight on f5, and there are a number of wins. White played a pretty simple one, just trading queens and then queen to f6. And both of these pawns are hanging, and the queen is hanging. So after black trades queens, they lose a pawn, and white still has a space advantage, and the knight on b6 is still a bad piece. So white won this endgame without any difficulties in just a few moves. So that is an interesting little disaster for black, which comes from the moment where black played knight to d5 here, right? And what I'd like you to be able to do is, the next time you see a move like knight d5, understand in your hearts immediately that that was not the critical move. That's the first thing. And the second thing, understand that, because of your advantages and their advantages, have a sense of how the game's going to go once your opponent plays a move like this. Okay, they didn't strike back at the center in the first few moves. Now I'm going to be able to just defend every square in the center, right? So you see it was like calm play by white, g3 followed by queen e2. White just defends those squares that black attacked, right? So know, okay, I'll be able to defend all these squares, I'll play calmly, and then later I'll smush him with the center, right? You have to know what your advantages are and what your opponent's advantages are. When they don't use their advantage, when they just throw it away, then you can exploit it if you know what your advantage was, right? And you make sort of a general plan of play that matches it. All right, hope that was useful. Got one more plan for you coming, so take care. I'm going to go record that. You guys can go wait a few more days for it to get published. Later.